There are moments of injustice so raw, so brutal, that if you stood there watching, you'd have to ask yourself, if I were there, would I just keep walking? Or would I stop? A young woman stood in chains, wrists torn, raw eyes stripped of hope, yet refusing to beg. Men jeered at her like she was nothing more than a bargain left over at some border town auction. And just beyond that circle of cruelty, a cowboy who had spent the last decade living in silence, his only companions, the wind, the dust, and a lonely stretch of land, happened to stop his wagon. He could have turned away, pretended he hadn't seen, but he also knew if he left her there, his silence would stain the rest of his life. Before we ride into this story, I'd like to invite you, especially those of you who still believe the Old West has lessons for today, to follow this channel. That way you won't miss stories like this, stories that remind us why standing up matters. Because these aren't just tales of the past, they're mirrors of who we choose to be now. Redstone Crossing. A little town set along a red dirt road lay heavy in the late summer heat. Cowboy Reed Holston guided his tired mule team through the main stretch wagon, creaking steady. For 10 long years, ever since burying his wife on the hill behind his ranch, Reed had lived like a shadow. His days were stitched together by chores, mending fence posts, hauling wood-checking troughs, and every Sunday standing at her grave with nothing to say, except nothing's changed. That morning he meant only to buy salt coffee, lamp oil nails, and a new whetstone. But the road narrowed with bodies gathered thick around the old livery yard. Reed heard the words rise out of the crowd auction. Last one left, worthless, and his hands tightened on the reins before he even realized he'd stopped. He stepped down, pushed through the cluster of men, and saw her. Awanada, last Apache woman left after some raid that stripped families apart. Her wrists were swollen where iron had cut the skin, yet she stood tall. The deerskin dress she wore hung torn, its fringe and beadwork still clinging here and there. The neckline was ripped so low it exposed the curve of her chest, not out of choice, but because modesty had protected her from nothing. She didn't shrink. She didn't cry. She fixed her gaze straight past the men as if they weren't worth seeing. Rage burned through Reed, not only at the cruelty of what he saw, but at how familiar it felt. After the war, he too had been looked at like something less than human, judged by memories he couldn't escape. He knew the hollow ache of being trapped by other people's contempt. And now this woman, standing chained before drunken laughter, was caught in the same cage of disdain. He could have walked away. He could have bought his nails and gone home, brewed his coffee, told himself it wasn't his problem. But he knew the truth. By sundown, someone with coin in his pocket and filth in his mind would claim her, and the outcome would be certain. Reed wasn't a saint. He was a worn-down cowboy with nothing left but stubborn bones. But sometimes one choice decides the rest of a man's life. His calloused hand slipped inside his coat, touched the folded bills he'd counted twice that morning. Without bargaining, without papers, he pressed the money into the trader's palm. The lock turned. The chains fell heavy against the dirt. Awanada didn't rub her wrists. She didn't thank him. Her eyes flicked to Reed, cold and sharp, measuring him the way someone measures danger. He turned back toward the wagon. She followed because every other path was worse. He didn't touch her, didn't order her, didn't even look her way until the wind came down sharp from the north. Her torn dress wouldn't hold against it. Reed shrugged off his coat, held it out. She stared at it, then at him, then laid it across her lap. She didn't put it on, but she didn't give it back either. Behind them, the laughter of the crowd faded. The mule team plodded forward, hooves beating a rhythm Reed knew by heart. Dust curled up from the rutted road, blurring the town into distance. Beside him sat the woman, once branded worthless, silent, but unbroken. Reed Holston didn't know what would come next. He only knew one thing: he could no longer live by turning away when injustice stared him down. And Awanada, her spine straight, her eyes refusing to bow, was no longer left standing in chains alone. That was the beginning. Born of loneliness, sharpened by anger, tempered by compassion. Two lives that should have stayed apart, now bound together by the choice of one cowboy who decided not to ride past. The road out of Redstone Crossing stretched north, winding through dry hills where brittle grass clung to cracked earth. Wagon wheels rattled over the ruts, the mules plodding on with weary rhythm. Neither Reed nor Awanada spoke. No questions. No thanks, just the sound of wind cutting across open land and hooves beating the dust. Every so often, Reed glanced at her. She sat straight-backed on the bench wrists, still raw where the iron had cut deep. Her hands rested quiet in her lap, black hair falling in tangles. Some sections still braided, others torn loose by wind and rough handling. But her eyes were fixed somewhere beyond the horizon. She wasn't looking at him, wasn't even looking at the road, but straight through it all. In that gaze, Reed saw not defeat, but a proud emptiness, the kind a person builds to survive, look through men, not at them. By the time dusk fell, they reached his ranch. Reed reined the team near the old well. The cabin door creaked as he pushed it open. He stepped aside, letting her enter first. Barefoot, she hesitated just enough to register the cold bite of packed earth under her soles. Inside, the small space seemed crowded already with nothing more than the weight of two lives now forced under the same roof. One room split by a low half wall, his bed on one side, a smaller bed built years ago for his wife, when she'd grown too weak to climb in and out of the higher frame. Reed pointed toward it, his voice low from years of disuse. "That bed. It's yours if you want. No commands, no rules. Just a plain offer." Awanada's eyes moved slowly across the room, the iron stove a table with uneven legs, a shelf with folded cloth. The faint trace of a woman's soap clung to things that hadn't been thrown away. On the table lay a silver ring. She noticed it. So did Reed. Quietly, he slipped it into his pocket without a word. He stirred the fire-ladled thick bean stew into 2 tin bowls, set one near her bed, kept the other for himself. She sat cross-legged on the floor by the stove coat over her knees, eating in silence. Reed sat at the table. Neither intruded. The only sounds were the scrape of spoons and the snap of burning wood. When the bowls were empty, Reed laid a folded blanket at the foot of her bed. Then he went to his own. No instructions, no locks, no orders. Awanada lay on her side, eyes wide open. Reed stared up at the rafters, counting the same knots he'd counted every night for years. In the hush of that small room, they both lay awake, breathing, listening to the wind against the walls, the sigh of the stove, and each other's presence. She waited tense for footsteps across the floor, for the sudden weight of a hand or command. None came. Reed stayed on his side, still and steady his breath, even as if keeping the silence intact for her sake. Slowly, not fully, but enough the edge of her fear dulled. Reed, too, lay heavy with thought. He pictured the grave on the hill, the wooden cross he had set with his own hands. He knew when Sunday came he'd have to stand there and admit, "I brought someone home." Not to replace you, but because leaving her behind would have been like leaving you again, and I couldn't do it twice. The guilt pressed in, but this time he didn't push it away. He let it rest beside him, part of the truth. Neither of them truly slept, but they endured the first night without harm, without demand, and that in itself was something. Morning light crept pale through the frost-glazed window. Reed woke first, as always. He turned his head slightly. On the smaller bed, Awanada lay curled beneath his coat, her hands folded beneath her cheek. Her breathing was deeper now, steadier than the restless hours before. Reed rose quietly, pulled on his boots, and stepped outside. The air cut sharp and cold, the sky stretched wide and hard as glass. For years he had measured mornings only in broken rails, sagging gates, chores that never ended. But that morning, he thought of something else, another presence inside the cabin. The silence that had once been hollow now carried weight. It was no longer just emptiness, it was the first fragile bridge toward compassion. Morning broke with a thin layer of mist settling over the valley, soft light spilling across the sagging fence line and the weather-beaten chicken coop. Reed was already awake as he always had been for years. He pulled on his worn boots, carried a bucket of water out into the biting cold, the kind that gnawed at the skin, but no longer fazed him. He thought Awanada would still be sleeping, but when he turned back, she was already at the doorway, wrapped in his old coat, arms folded tight against her thin frame. Her hair was braided more neatly than the night before. Her eyes still held caution, but the sharpness had dulled just a fraction. Reed set the bucket down and nodded toward the chicken coop where the hinge sagged and squealed. Needs fixing. She didn't answer, only looked where he pointed. Reed gathered nails and a hammer, then walked toward the north fence where a section had blown down in the last storm. To his surprise, Awanada followed, keeping a measured distance. He didn't wave her back. He just set to work, digging holes, resetting posts, stretching wire. Each swing of the mallet rang out heavy across the quiet land. At first she stood aside, arms crossed, coat pulled close. Then when she saw him struggle with the weight of a fence post, sweat darkening the back of his shirt, she stepped forward. Without a word, she bent down, grasped another post, and dragged it toward the open ground. Reed paused, glanced at her, then gave the smallest nod. No more was needed. They worked in tandem. When the hammer handle was too thick for her grip, Reed passed her a smaller one. When the wire cut her palm and left a smear of blood, he stripped off his gloves and handed them to her. Awanada didn't thank him, but her eyes softened slightly, less distant than the day before. The morning wore on, filled with the rhythm of tools, breathing, and wind. The silence was no longer a wall. It was a rhythm they shared. By noon, Reed pulled out his canteen and handed it to her first. She drank carefully, wiped her mouth, and passed it back. He took his turn without a word. That small act of sharing, quiet as it was, carried more meaning than speech could have. That afternoon, they turned to the chicken coop. The door sagged hard against a rusted hinge. Reed muttered under his breath as he pried at a bent nail, but before he could force it back in place, Awanada disappeared. Minutes later, she returned with a scrap of wire and an old nail she'd dug up from the yard. She knelt, looped the wire, neatly tapped the nail into place, and the door swung smoother than before. Reed stood back, watching her work. For the first time in years, the corner of his mouth twitched toward a smile. Supper passed in near silence. The bean stew dwindled in their bowls, the fire popped in the stove. This time Awanada didn't eat on the floor, but moved closer to the table. Not too close, but closer. Reed noticed, said nothing, only let her choose her own distance. Afterward, he pulled lumber and nails from the corner, measuring along the far wall to build a divider for privacy. She sat near the fire, arms around her knees, eyes fixed on him. At last her voice broke the silence, hoarse from long disuse. Why, the hammer in his hand stilled. He turned. Her eyes were on him, steady this time, not sliding past. "Why did you bring me here?" Reed set the hammer aside, exhaled slow. His gaze was heavy, but unflinching. Because no one else should have. And because here, there's room. Silence filled the space again, but it wasn't sharp anymore. It felt like a truth laid bare. Awanada gave one short nod, then turned back to the fire. This time she didn't look away so quickly. That night she lay on the small bed. Reed heard the faint shift of blankets, then the slower rhythm of her breathing. He sat up once, glancing across the room. Firelight traced her profile still, but not as guarded. Her brow eased. It was the first time she allowed herself to rest. Reed lay back, staring at the rafters, and for the first time in years felt something close to peace settle in. The next day, they would work again. Maybe no more words than before, but each gesture, each task shared, was another quiet step toward trust. In the language of labor, they had found a way to speak to one another without speaking at all. And from that trust began to take root. The days that followed settled into the rhythm of work. At dawn, Reed walked the fence lines. By midday, they split dry biscuits or salted pork. In the afternoons, Awanada swept the cabin or mended a torn blanket with bits of thread found in an old drawer. They spoke little, relying instead on glances and small gestures. Yet in those stretches of silence, their presence beside one another slowly began to feel natural. One evening, as the sun slid low behind the western ridge, they worked side by side on the last stretch of fence. Reed drove the post, Awanada steadied the wire. When the job paused, he sank down onto a log, sweat streaking his worn shirt. His eyes drifted out toward the field, and the words came rough, pulled up like stones from deep water. "My wife's been gone 10 years. Awanada looked at him. He didn't meet her gaze, only kept talking low and even. 1 week sick. Fever wouldn't break. I buried her behind the cabin under the maple tree. A chill swept across the open land. Awanada let the wire drop from her hands, wiped her palms against her dress. Finally she spoke, voice thin but steady. I was sold because I would not bow. My father said I shamed him. After the raid, no one came. Perhaps they decided I was already dead. 2 stories worlds apart, yet both heavy with loss. Silence pressed down again, but not the wary silence of strangers. It was the silence of 2 people holding space for each other's grief. Reed broke a stick in his hands, his voice measured. Here. You don't answer to anyone. Her eyes locked on his, sharp and searching. Even if I speak against you. He nodded slowly. Say what you need. I'll listen. She didn't reply, only studied him for a long moment, then turned back to the fire. A brief nod followed, enough to mark the shift. That night the cabin glowed faintly with lamplight. Reed sat at the table working a whetstone along the edge of an old knife. Awanada crouched near the stove, stitching cloth to patch her torn dress. The room was quiet, but no longer cold. When she spoke, her voice carried a grounded certainty. I don't want to be wife. I don't want to be slave. Reed set the knife down, eyes lifting. No one here belongs to anyone. The fire cracked, flaring once, as if sealing the promise. That night she didn't turn her back to him completely. Wrapped in a blanket, face angled toward the fire, her eyes half shut, lashes trembling with the first trace of ease. From his bed, Reed watched in the dim glow. Something had shifted the space between them, though still there had eased. The days went on. Awanada told him about her grandfather who taught her to build fences, saying if you can hold a boundary, you can keep life inside it. Reed spoke of his years as a Union scout of the Suspicion, and stares that followed him long after the war ended. Each story carried scars, but laid bare in the open, they began to heal. One evening, Awanada murmured near the fire, I used to think silence was punishment. When they tied me, ordered me, I stopped speaking. Easier than having words turned against me. Reed kept his gaze on the flames. His voice was low, but sure. Here silence isn't punishment. It's peace. She turned toward him, weighing the truth of it in his eyes. Then she gave a small nod. No more words, but in her expression a hint of relief showed for the first time. That night before sleep, she dragged her bed slightly closer to the fire. Not much, but enough to share more warmth. Reed noticed, said nothing. He only pulled his own blanket higher. The distance between them had shortened. The next morning, when they walked out to the pasture, she no longer followed several paces behind. She walked beside him. Their shadows stretched long and parallel across the ground. No longer 2 figures apart, but 2 lives moving forward in step. In work, in words, and even in silence, they had found common ground, trust, built not on promises, but on the courage to share and to listen. Winter swept in with winds sharp as a knife, laying the first thin coat of snow across the cabin roof. The ground froze hard. Daylight shortened, and the stove fire became the only heart keeping the cabin warm. In that bitter cold, the distance between Reed and Awanada began to shrink bit by bit, not with words, but through the smallest of gestures, tentative at first, then quietly familiar. It started with a hand brushing another as they threaded wire along the fence. Reed pulled back quickly, but Awanada didn't flinch. She let it be as though the touch was not a threat. Another time, when he passed her the canteen, she met his eyes before drinking only for a second, but steady enough to linger in his mind. These small moments, hesitant yet deliberate, spoke louder than speech. Evenings found them near the fire. Reed stitched old tack or worked a strip of leather, while Awanada sat braiding her hair, her profile lit in the flicker of the flames. Sometimes their eyes met. At first they both turned away, embarrassed by the sudden weight of it. But gradually those glances stretched longer, until silence between them felt less like avoidance and more like acknowledgement. One night the wind rattled the shutters, snow stung against the window panes. Awanada pulled the coat closer, yet the cold still seeped through. Reed rose, laid another log on the fire, then without thinking, draped an extra blanket across her shoulders. She looked up, her dark eyes steady on his. This time he didn't look away. His chest tightened with something unfamiliar, something he hadn't felt in years, a nervous quickening that wasn't fear, but the memory of closeness. The next day, while clearing snow from the chicken shed, Awanada's foot slipped. Reed caught her wrist firm but gentle. She steadied herself, heart racing, not from the fall, but from the warmth of his grip. When he let go, the imprint of his hand lingered against her skin long after. That evening, the room seemed charged. Awanada sat on an old rug by the fire, arms wrapped around her knees. Reed sat in his chair, turning a strip of leather between his fingers, doing nothing with it. The air wasn't hostile. It was taut, like a string waiting to be plucked. Then Awanada moved. Slowly, with a measured calm that still carried hesitation, she stepped toward him. Standing before his chair, she placed a hand lightly on his knee and leaned down. Her lips brushed his soft, brief but real. Reed's breath caught. It wasn't hunger, it wasn't command, it was choice. When she pulled back, her gaze held his steady in the firelight. There was no fear, no resistance, only a silent declaration she had chosen to stay, not as someone bound, but as someone who decided. Reed didn't reach for her, didn't pull her closer. He let the choice remain hers, and she, after a moment, gave a small nod, then lowered herself to sit near him, back, resting against the leg of his chair. Neither spoke. The silence now was transformed, no longer empty, but warm, shared a silence that carried trust. That night she no longer turned fully away from him. On the small bed she lay facing the fire, eyes closed, lashes trembling, as if testing the safety of sleep. From his bed across the room, Reed watched the firelight dance across her features, felt the quiet gratitude rising in his chest. Trust hadn't come from promises. It had come from that hesitant kiss, a fragile bridge laid between two people no longer alone. By morning, the snow had blanketed the pasture white, the pale sun glaring off drifts of ice. Reed stepped outside, boots crunching, breath steaming in the cold. When he looked back, Awanada had followed, not trailing behind, but walking beside him. Their shadows stretched across the snow together, parallel, no longer apart. In silence, with every glance, every brush of a hand, they carried the certainty of something new. They had stepped out of fear, through silence, and into trust. The winter nights rolled on cold, settling deep into the land. Snow piled heavy on the cabin roof, wind howled through the ridge. But inside that one-room home, warmth grew not only from the fire, but from the company of two souls, no longer alone. Awanada no longer kept her distance. She grew accustomed to sitting near Reed while he stitched an old saddle, to the steady sound of his boots across the floor, to the way he always let her choose her place within the cabin. His silence, once a thing that made her wary, had become the ground where her heart could finally rest. One evening by the fire, Reed worked a blade against a whetstone lamplight, tracing the hard lines of his face. Awanada studied him for a long moment before speaking, her voice rough but firm. "Your wife, was she beautiful?" The question stilled his hand. He set the knife down, gaze drifting as though through the cabin walls to the grave out back. At last, he answered slowly. "She was, but not the way most people mean. She was small, always cold, laughed louder than anyone expected, and she stayed even when she didn't have to." Awanada's lips pressed tight. Then she said what weighed on her chest. "I cannot replace her." Reed turned his eyes steady. "I don't need her replaced." The fire cracked. The wind rattled the door, but for a moment it was only the two of them, caught in a silence that felt like truth. Awanada's gaze didn't waver. She needed to know if she was truly being chosen, or just filling an empty space in a lonely man's life. Reed seemed to understand. He crossed to the shelf, lifted a scrap of cloth, and revealed a silver ring worn smooth with years. He held it in his palm and came back to her. No kneeling, no grand proposal, just a plain offering, voice low but firm. "It doesn't belong to the past anymore. If you take it, it's a choice for today." Awanada's eyes fixed on the ring, then on him. Her breath trembled. Slowly she reached out, slipped her hand into his, and let the ring rest there between them. No chains, no commands, just consent, just choice. That night, seated by the fire, Awanada leaned her head against his shoulder. For the first time, Reed wrapped his arm around her, feeling the quiet strength of her body against his. It wasn't companionship out of necessity anymore. It was belonging real and whole. Love had been affirmed. In the days that followed, the cabin shifted in small, certain ways. Awanada no longer guarded her own bed. Some mornings she woke in the larger one, her breath rising and falling with his. She folded her clothing neatly on the shelf beside his things, as though the space had been waiting for her all along. Reed, a man of few words, began to understand that silence itself could carry love. One morning, when the snow had finally stopped, pale sunlight streamed through the window. Reed stood on the porch, surveying the blanketed fields. Awanada joined him, her hand settling lightly on his arm. No words were needed. That single touch said enough. She was here, and she was his choice as much as he was hers. He turned toward her. In her eyes he saw no fear, no guardedness, only the calm of someone who had decided to stay. And she saw in him not a man clinging to the past, but one willing to open his heart again. Together they knew what they shared wasn't born out of replacing what had been lost. It was born from the courage to live in the present. They weren't just surviving another winter anymore. They were truly living in warmth, in love. And the silver ring, once a relic of memory, had become a symbol of beginning again. Spring came slow, but certain. Snow melted in steady drips off the cabin roof, the ground softened underfoot, and the air filled with the damp scent of new grass and thawing sap. In that turning of the season, Awanada began to notice changes in her body. She tired more easily, her steps slowed, and the days that should have arrived came and went without sign. One morning, with sunlight spilling across the cabin floor, she sat on the step, hand resting lightly against her stomach, her gaze far away. Reed was stacking wood by the shed when he saw her stillness. He walked closer, wiping sweat from his brow. His voice was low, careful. "Something wrong?" Awanada turned steady-eyed. I may be with child." The words fell into the air, and even the spring breeze seemed to pause. Reed froze, his rough hand still at his sides. For a moment his eyes carried both shock and weight. 10 years of solitude had bound him to the grave behind the cabin, to the certainty that no new life would ever come. The thought of a child, of a future, was something he had buried with his wife. Yet now, here it stood before him. He moved closer, sat down across from her. "You're sure I don't know for certain, but I've counted, more than once." Reed drew in a long breath, eyes drifting out toward the pasture, greening again after months of snow. Then he looked back, meeting her gaze with a steadiness that surprised even himself. "If it's true, then I'm ready." The words weren't spoken out of duty. They rang with decision, with the resolve of a man who had lost much but still had the courage to embrace hope when it returned. Awanada lowered her head against his chest, her shoulders easing for the first time in days. Reed wrapped his arms around her, hand resting against her back, holding her, and the fragile promise of the life to come. From that day forward, the cabin began to change. Reed carved into pine boards, each stroke shaping the beginnings of a cradle. He built new shelves along the wall, so nothing lay scattered. Awanada patched old cloth into squares, stacking them carefully, preparing the first quilt for the baby. Small acts, yet each one transformed the cabin into more than a shelter. It became a home waiting for the sound of a newborn's cry. One afternoon, while Reed sanded the cradle's frame, Awanada stepped beside him, laying her hand across the smooth wood. For the first time, she smiled, without holding it back. "It will need a name," she said softly. Reed set down his hammer, his voice quiet but sure. "If it's a boy, I'd name him after my father." Awanada's eyes brightened. "And if it's a girl, we let her choose her own name when she's ready." Reed chuckled low, but real. It was the first laughter in years, and it filled the cabin warmer than the lamp ever had. Day by day, hope grew with every small sign. Awanada walked slower, but her steps carried certainty. She no longer searched the horizon for someone from the past. Instead, her eyes settled on the soil, on the green shoots she planted along the fence line. Reed, too, changed. He visited his wife's grave less often, not from forgetting, but from peace. The past had found its rest. What needed tending now was the present and the days yet to come. One morning, after tending the mules, Reed returned to see Awanada sitting on the porch, hands folded gently across her belly. Sunlight draped her in a soft glow. He stood there a long while, taking her in his chest, filled with something he hadn't dared feel in years, the certainty that life, no matter how scarred, could bloom again. Hope was no longer a memory or a far-off dream. It lived now, beating in their hearts, growing within her, and reshaping a cabin once bound by silence into a true home. A home for a new family built on love, carrying a promise for tomorrow. That spring stretched wide across the valley in a blanket of green. Snow melted into trickling streams down the ridges. The soil softened and breathed with the scent of new growth. Wildflowers pushed up along the fence line where Reed and Awanada had worked side by side through winter's cruelty. No longer the shadow of loneliness, only the stirring of life beginning again. Reed led Awanada through the field. Her belly was not yet showing only the faintest hint of change, but in her eyes already glowed the quiet light of a mother. Her fingers laced through his holding firm, as if to anchor them both in this new road. No longer two survivors, but two who were truly living. They stopped at the small grave beneath the old maple. For 10 years it had bound Reed to grief, the cross he had built by hand, weathered now with moss, yet the tree above had sprouted tender leaves. Even the place that once held only sorrow seemed to whisper of renewal. In Awanada's hand rested the silver ring. She placed it in his palm. Reed studied it for a long moment, the object that had tethered him to the past. Then he knelt, digging a shallow hollow beside the grave. Together they lowered the ring into the earth and covered it. Neither wept, neither spoke farewell. But in their eyes there was peace. "The past is at rest," Reed said softly. "And from now on, we live," Awanada answered. The sky above seemed clearer for it. The spring wind lifted across the grass, carrying the scent of beginnings. Back at the cabin, the work of everyday life carried a new rhythm. The cradle Reed had carved stood finished near the fire. Awanada hung a piece of cloth she had embroidered Apache patterns woven together with scraps of American linen. The house that once echoed with silence now breathed with color, with a mingling of two heritages, two souls, two stories bound into one. That evening's meal was plain bean stew, coarse bread. Yet when Reed passed her a bowl, and she smiled in return, the room lit with a warmth no lantern could match. Happiness, they realized, was not built on promises spoken aloud, but in the daily choosing of one another. Days unfolded gently. Reed still walked the fields, checked the fences, tended the mules. Awanada planted seeds, patched old clothes, prepared for the child that would soon come. Simple tasks, yet each bore new meaning. Every swing of the hammer, every stitch of thread was a vow made quietly to the life ahead. One afternoon, under the amber wash of sunset, Awanada stood on the porch with her hands over her belly, her gaze on the horizon. Reed stepped behind her, his arm slipping across her shoulders. They said nothing, only looked out together. Both knew life was no longer a lonely march, but the building of a family. And this is where we, the ones following their story, must ask ourselves, is there anything more precious than seeing two souls, once bound by loss, now planting the roots of a home, preparing to bring new life into the world? If you believe Reed and Awanada deserve this happiness, offer them your blessing. Imagine the child that will grow here, learning the patience of fence building from Reed, the strength of endurance from Awanada, carrying in their blood the legacy of two worlds. Reed will have to learn fatherhood, a role unfamiliar to hands that once knew only rope and rifle. He will worry when the baby cries at night, his calloused fingers clumsy as he cradles fragile new life. Yet he will smile, because for the first time in a decade, his mornings will no longer begin with silence, but with the sound of breath and promise. Awanada, once cast aside and called unwanted, will find her worth in nurturing. She will teach her child the old songs of her people, planting pride in their roots. And she will be the bridge that makes their home not only a shelter, but a place where two traditions live together. Western grit and Apache honor, side by side. Their story doesn't end here. It only begins. True love is not simply finding one another, but building each day forward through seasoned storms and even the whispers of judgment from the town beyond. So what should their next steps be? Perhaps building a wider porch where a child might play in the shade. Perhaps planting more corn and barley to feed a family. Most importantly, perhaps learning to open their doors to others, so their child will grow up knowing they belong not to one world, but to both. And we gathered around this story can walk with them too. Show your support for their journey, because in cheering them on, we remind ourselves even in the harshest lands love can take root. Reed and Awanada laid the old ring to rest. In choosing each other, they opened a new beginning, no longer surviving by the day they are living, building a future with a home, with a family, with hope.